So today on the show, I'm very excited to welcome Brandi Starr. So Brandi is a marketing powerhouse with over 20 years of experience shaking up B2B and B2C companies. She is the COO at Tegrita, which is a consultancy that unlocks the power of email. She's all about transforming processes, enhancing go-to-market strategies, and ensuring smooth customer experiences. She's named as one of the top 50 women in MarTech. She blends strategic vision with operational savvy. She's also the co-author of a CMO to CRO, which I'm sure we will get into, and the host of the Revenue Rehab podcast, which she was very gracious to have me on pretty recently. Brandi, great to have you on the show.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So before we throw on the recorder, we're talking about different places we can go, and I think there's lots of jumping off points. I think the one that I'd like to start with, per the name of your book, is the progression of the CMO role. So, in your career, can you talk a little bit about how you've seen that role evolve?
Yeah, right now there is so much debate around the CMO role, whether it should exist, what those responsibilities should be, etc. And I've been in marketing now over 20 years. And if I think about the CMOs that I had when I was super new in my career, they really focused a lot more on brand. And it was purely, they were purely the brand person. They, controlled the look and feel. They handled a lot of the events and those sorts of things. As we have progressed, we've gotten more technology, more sophistication. True CMOs have really they've taken the ing out and have become chief market officers and have become the person in the C-suite who really owns the market. So not just the brand, but really understanding the market in which that organization plays, who their customers are, how revenue flows and how to impact that. And so the role of CMO has gotten a lot more sophisticated over the years and a lot more broad.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it seems like one of the main things behind that, or correct me if you think otherwise, is just the need to show I did this and it produced this revenue over here. So to be able to answer that question, you have to have all this other knowledge. Um, and sometimes I'll go a little bit too far out, but I'm super interested in this stuff. Is what do you think are the bigger forces that have produced that change in that role?
I think tech plays a huge role in that because if you think about way back in the day, there was very little in marketing that could be directly measured and tied to revenue. So you think about when we were, you run an ad in a magazine, so to speak. This was back before we had custom URLs and things like that. There was some lift that happened coming to the website, but you can't really say that ad had any, impact or not. And so it was one of those, we make our best effort. And as long as the numbers trend in the right direction, everything's, A-okay, thumbs up. As we've gotten more technology and more ability to track, this is where marketing has gotten more scientific. And we've been able to see some direct impact of the things that marketing is doing and be able to connect that impact to revenue. And so once that ability existed, then that's when it became an expectation. And once you have that expectation, that role is forever changed, and marketing went from being more art to a blend of art and science.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the main window that we get into that here at Sales Schema is really learning about how our agency clients work with the brands that they're working with. And I think one example that comes to mind are e-commerce agencies, and specifically Amazon agencies, because they're not really like a typical just, hey, let me show you how to market this thing sort of role. It's they've got to have full understanding and often control of inventory, because the inventory and the ability of the company to fulfill affects the ability for them to market effectively on Amazon, and there's all these different intricacies to it. With that, I'd love to learn more. Can you talk a little bit about, like, just to give people more a bigger frame of reference, like the clients you're working with and how you're helping them navigate this kind of thing?
Yep. The majority of our clients are B2B medium to enterprise organizations. So most of our clients are 25 million annual revenue and above, and typically will have a longer sales cycle, meaning that middle of funnel conversation and ability to move them from, considering making a change to actually making a purchase is a bit longer and a whole lot more important. And so for those clients, we really help them to connect the two places they're spending all their money. If we really look at where marketing spend is happening, there's a lot of spend at the top of the funnel to attract people to the business. And then salespeople are most often some of the most expensive resources within the go-to-market function. And so quite often what happens, and this is why you see people who hate the MQL, the marketing qualified lead, because historically it's like, oh, they downloaded an ebook, MQL, they're ready for sales. And that's not the case. Those are people that have shown some interest in the topic in which you sell on, but they're not necessarily ready to buy. And so how you orchestrate those communications and do so in a way that builds trust, provides the information that they need, and moves them to the point of wanting to engage with the sales team is really, really critical. And one of those things so many companies just haven't figured out.
Yeah. So, and not to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like the approach is that the middle of funnel is kind of neglected, if I understand that right.
Yes.
And why do you think that is?
Um, it's so I think it is partially neglected because it doesn't cost so much. It's one of those things that you think about wherever we're spending large chunks of our budget, there's some expectation of return. And although email is not the only channel in the middle of the funnel, it is the primary channel. And email marketing has the lowest cost compared to channels. And so it's one of those things where companies believe that they can afford to kind of suck in the middle. Whereas really they're thinking about it from a budget perspective as opposed to thinking about it from a lost opportunity perspective. I also think that there is this misconception that because the buyer journey is so all over the place now, like it's not as linear as it used to be, there's this misconception that we can no longer really orchestrate that journey and do something about it. And while it, is never going to be exact, with technology, there are lots of ways that we can effectively orchestrate that journey. And so I think it's that blend of less pressure to be successful with the middle of the funnel, as well as less capability and understanding with how to make it happen.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it makes sense in some ways, but it's a little bit counterintuitive because usually the thing that's more expensive is the thing that gets used less, where people will cheap out and try to do as much as they can with the cheap part. But it also seems like maybe there's like neophilia, where it's like you want the net new wins because it's easier to measure and they're loud when they happen, where it's like we got this many calls this month versus all these in between metrics are kind of harder to track sometimes, um but I'm speculating. So I guess with that, what is like an organization that's really handling middle of funnel well? Like what are they doing and how would you describe that?
Yeah, so those that are doing it amazingly well have a defined and documented journey. And that journey is essentially most common scenario. We know how people progress through it is going to vary every single time. We can't account for that. But really thinking about someone going through this buying process, what sort of information are they likely to need? What questions are they likely to need answers to? Who is likely a part of the decision criteria or the decision conversations? And making sure that we put content and information out there that speaks to that whole thing, and that we use digital body language to make some safe assumptions about where they are in that journey and what that next right thing is. And so those that are getting this, getting this right are the people where their entire funnel is connected. Everything that is happening within lead generation, there's a clear understanding of when they engage or do certain things, what should happen next. And there's a clear handshake agreement between marketing and sales as to when someone is actually ready to talk to sales. And I'm speaking about this a lot around net new acquisition because that's the most common use case. But this process is the same for current customers as well. We want to cross-sell, upsell, and depending on what you sell, in some cases renew. That middle of funnel journey is just as important, and in some cases more important for your current customers as well.
Yeah, that's great, and it makes a lot of sense. I think where things are always difficult is that demarcation line between marketing and sales. And it seems like a line that is moving more rapidly and chaotically than it used to, because you have more and more tools, especially with AI, that can do more without a person having to be involved. And marketing's, automation's gotten more sophisticated and all these things, that it's harder to figure out, okay, like when does the human need to be there and what can they do that the machine can't right now? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I actually think that we create the chaos. And I think it's really a mentality issue. So if we take out what tech you have available, because depending on the company, they've got more sophisticated, less sophisticated resources. If the go-to-market function comes to an agreement on this is what sales ready looks like. So whether that is a certain amount of information has been captured, engagement with certain types of assets, a certain level of engagement, whatever that looks like, if we can agree on what that is, like what that point is that a human needs to be involved, we can then architect how we determine when to get there. And so if we're all working towards the same goal, this is where marketing can say, okay, we're going to leverage email in these places. If we've got AI, this is where we're going to bring AI in to simulate a little bit of a sales engagement. And when we get to the destination, that point we've agreed on, that's when a human is going to be involved. And so if we start by just coming to that, and that's why I call it that handshake agreement on what is sales ready, where should the human get involved, all the rest is just figuring out the if-thens, the tactics, etc., in order to get to that point. And so that's why I really think it's us that overcomplicates that by not having those tough conversations, because sometimes it's a battle. We've been through helping clients get to an agreement on that, and sometimes you really got to fight it out to agree on what that is. But once we settle on that, that's when it becomes easy.
Right. That makes sense. Is there an example or a story you could tell about that, about like a client that maybe landed on that right demarcation or got it from vague to more specific and so on?
Yeah, there's a funny one that it actually got uncomfortable in the room, but it was a situation. I had been working with a client that was in Toronto, and there was a huge gap in the agreement between what was sales ready. Marketing, it was the typical story. Marketing was generating leads. They were passing them to sales. Sales was ignoring them. Marketing was frustrated because they felt like they were wasting their budget. Sales was, saying that they weren't getting anything from marketing. They were pointless. And it was to the point that it made it difficult for marketing to get budget approval to move forward with anything. And so through some convincing, I got them to agree to get everybody in a room. And we had the whole marketing team, and we had 4 representatives from the sales team, because of course, no way to get whole sales team, in a meeting. And we started by going through what marketing defined as sales ready. And we let them react to that. And I had already prepared the marketing team that the reaction was probably not going to be pleasant and that they should just woosah and let it go. And that's exactly what happened. They ripped it to shreds. It was like, doing this doesn't make sense, and this doesn't make sense, and I need to know. And so as they started talking about what they needed, I just grabbed a marker and just started writing words on the whiteboard. And once things calmed down, then I went back and said, okay, what I'm hearing is, and I read them all the things. And at first they were like, yes, that's what we need. Well, I recognized some gaps there. And so then I asked questions and I said, okay, so what you're saying is unless someone fills out a form and says, contact me, you don't want to talk to them. And they're like, well, people don't fill out forms and and so then they start backtracking on the things that they were saying. And so it was a very careful, and this is where having a third party comes in is really valuable, because it was a very careful orchestration of me repeating back to them the meaning of what they were asking for. And for a couple hours, we were at a bit of a standstill where it just was this back and forth. And then after a while, it was almost like I broke through. And I mean, it was like the environment in the room changed. And then I had a guy go, let me rephrase my opinion. And then he broke down what he really cared about. And then marketing said, well, here's a way that shows up in the data. Is that what you mean? And so we got to that point where it started to say, okay, you're saying this. Here's how we can recognize that. Does that feel fair? And it got to the point where it was like, yes, yes. And then through that, I was able to really quickly document out, here's our agreement. Does everybody feel comfortable with this? And there were some, there were some places where we had to do a little bit of tweaking on the back end. It wasn't 100% settled in that room, but we got probably to about 90% of the way where there were very clear and realistic definitions of when sales was willing to talk to someone. And so then marketing just restructured everything that it was doing because it had to get them there or not pass it over. And that's where the orchestration on the marketing side became so much easier, because it's like, we have to have this data that changed what was going on their forms and when forms were used. Here's the kinds of things they want them to consume before talking to them if they don't raise their hand. And then after that, it was just like, get stuff done.
Yeah, I love that story for a few reasons. The first is that, because I've been in sales forever, most of our clients are in sales, you just sort of make these assumptions in your head about what somebody's readiness, but you've never really defined them, and it's all just kind of like in the air and inexact. So that process sounds like it was super useful. The other thing that I'm curious about, and hopefully this question makes sense, is that once somebody goes through a process like that and they have their numbers over here that are either artificially inflated or deflated because the process is broken, they get to a place, where the process is more fixed and the salespeople are talking to people they want to talk to and so on. Do you find that the numbers start to reflect some sort of scientific reality or consistency, some sort of benchmark that you see across companies once people have gone through this process? Or is it still just kind of all variable and so on?
No, I do start to see consistency, and getting to this process is where then you are better enabled to push back on some of those goals that are arbitrary. Because it is one of those things that without data, if someone says, okay, we got to hit this number with no context for how we're going to get there, it's really hard for a marketing or sales leader to go, hold up, we may not be able to do that. But once we come to this agreement and we do some testing, some optimization, we get a bit of predictability in how people are going to move through the journey. And I always talk about micro conversions. It's not just the net new name to lead. There's a lot of things that happen in there. And then from lead to qualified, there's a lot of things that happen in there. When we've got that data and we've, put that rigor behind it, when we're handed a goal that's just not realistic, we're able to have that conversation and say, you know what, if we want to hit that, we need a budget of this because we have to do X, Y, and Z. Or with our current budgets, here is the output that we can realistically expect. Now let's add a stretch on top of that, not a whole leap. And right now there are, there's a meme that says it's something about our goals being agreed upon delusion. And that's so true in so many companies. It's like everybody knows there's no shot at hitting those goals, but we've just all agreed to be consistently delusional. And that makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah, that's a great meme. It makes something that I need to probably put on our wall or something like that. Um, so I guess with that, like I was gonna go somewhere else, but I kind of now that you talked about goal setting, I want to do a little sidebar on that. What do you see as a healthy way to think about goal setting in an organization?
I personally, and this is a very blanket statement because there's so many variables that impact goals, but for me, I like attainable with a stretch. Like that is generally okay, where do we feel like with, everything aligned, where do we think we can get? Okay, let's add a bit on top of that. And then I generally as a leader will also have sort of a extra stretch that's like my, secret goal of where I really want to get, but it's not on paper, it's not communicated anywhere because to me it can be like those goals that are unrealistic can be a demotivator for teams. It's like when you're going in and you're like, there's no way I'm going to get to this, it can kill your creativity. It can, it's like there's so many ways you are setting your team up for failure by having goals that are completely unrealistic. And, just me as a personal leader, I like to push people and stretch them, but stretch them in a way that we are, moving the needle in the right direction and that we feel like we can actually attain it. And so to me, you've got to look at like what can we actually do? And if we want a bigger goal, then often that comes with a bigger investment, whether it's budget or human resources. And it's like if we're going to push for that, then you got to also put the money behind it to support that. And so again, it goes back to being realistic and stretching.
Yeah, and whenever we're talking with agency owners and everybody says they want to grow, and our first question is why? Because it's going to take, a lot of time, a lot of energy, and depending on how much it is and how fast it is, usually what I'm trying to figure out is like, do you actually want to 5x in a year? Like, is that, or you just think you should want that?
Yeah.
Because to actually do that, it's going to be very painful.
Yeah, and slow
So,
growth is not a bad thing. Like is
yeah.
I think so much of the tech world has created this idea that we've gotta always be growing by something X and these crazy percentages. But there's a lot of drawbacks in a business, especially for a service-based business where you are essentially selling your people. Trying to grow that fast, not that it's impossible, but it's got some negatives to it that you really have to consider the impact of the business and the brand.
Yeah, absolutely. To keep going on these sort of metrics and focusing on middle funnel and so on, one thing you talked about before we threw on the recorder is the idea of kind of like focusing on brand first and how we want there to be this like linear path through the funnel. And there's a lot of software companies and others that are like, this is what happens here. And then they go through this, they download that, they're on a call, they buy within this long. But we all have kind of learned that it's this topsy-turvy path where people might check in and check out and go to weird places, and we might track some of it, but not other things. So to bring that to our question, hopefully, I'd love to hear like, what's your experience with that? And do you think it's always been like that and we've just been marketed the clean, nice thing? Or do you think something's changed to make it more topsy-turvy?
I think it's both. So one, I do think that once we got the ability to track, all of a sudden that is what became important. And there were the question was always raised, how much effort should we put into brand is so hard to measure, maybe we shouldn't be doing that, all those sorts of things. So we've been taught that narrative that because brand is so hard to measure, that it should be a thing that you do a little bit of because it's needed, but you don't spend too much effort there. And then I also think that post pandemic, and this is where I have seen it a lot, brand has become significantly more important. And I think this happened for two reasons. I think one of the positives that came out of the pandemic was a lot more human centric focus. It was like everybody all of a sudden was allowed to be humans, and not just these machines that worked. And I think that made us want to have more of a human connection, even with the brands that we do business with. Fast forward, and as AI and technology has grown, I think that human centric connection with a brand and the story of that brand has become that much more important, because the ability to produce and how much you can put out there and how sophisticated you can be with it, like AI has leveled the playing field to a certain degree, in that small companies can scale to the size of large companies. And so because of that, like brand and the brand story has become so much more important. So I think it is a both, that we've kind of always been that way, but then it also has changed.
Right, that makes sense. And how, I mean, we're kind of entering this weird period where like in a year we might have like full-time AI employees that we like talk to through, voice and video chat, and things are going to get strange. I guess like how do you have any, is there anything that you're seeing that would be surprising in terms of how your clients are starting to use AI that's beyond just the normal using a Claude, whatever to clean up a document or something? Like how is that panning out right now?
So the interesting thing for me has been how we internally, as well as clients, have been able to automate workflows with AI. Like we're still, we've got agentic AI and it exists, and there are, a handful of people that are starting to do some savvy things with that. I would say true agents haven't reached the masses yet. But just being able to leverage a Claude Chat GPT, using a Zapier or a Make or a similar tool to build out workflows where you are able to automate some things, that has been the thing that's been really blowing my mind, because it has been able to give so much scale, and ease of use. And even for a multitasker like me, who I know they say unitasking is the way to go, and I haven't gotten there yet. But like if I'm driving, I can talk to Chat GPT and it can transcribe what I'm talking about, and I can have a process built on the back end that before I get to my destination, it's turned that voice recording into something usable. Like these are those sorts of things that right now for me are blowing my mind, but I wouldn't say they are necessarily anything extremely unique. It is just more the creativity around how do we get better and faster? Because to me, if we can do our jobs better and faster, it frees us up more time to like be present in the things that we love as people.
Yeah, and what I keep going back and forth about is how fast is it going to take to latch on a mass level, right? Only because the internet's been around for a long time, but we've all encountered so many legacy organizations that are like barely even using it, like even after all this time, that it's hard to say. But it's definitely perhaps moving faster. So to shift gears a little bit, since our audience are largely agency owners and that sort of thing, and you're working with CMOs, other C-level people in mid market, can you talk about like what is life on the ground like right now? Like if our clients are like reaching out to a CMO, what is their life like? I know it's kind of a broad question, but I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
Hectic. If I had to summarize it, it is hectic.
Yeah.
Because, I both do consulting for some of our clients as well as I lead our own internal marketing. I have a unique vantage point of kind of being on both sides of the fence. And so I'm in a number of CMO and go to market communities, and I see all the conversations. And things right now are truly hectic. There is so much that is changing. I mean, you think about we went through this phase of there being so much PE and VC money, and it was like growth at all cost. And now, money has dried up to a certain extent, and there's a lot more pressures around being able to show improve. we've got lots of, economic uncertainty, which has yielded layoffs. With the current political climate, there's all sorts of things around taxes and, safety and so many things. Like, people holistically, both personally and professionally, are processing a lot. And within organizations, there is a lot of constant change. And the CMO has their hands in so many areas of the business that hectic, while also exciting, because the role is evolving so much. There are so many people that are very, like, they're excited and they're having the opportunity to learn a lot more, where there had been a little bit of stagnation of, I'm going to go do the same thing for another company. So there is that positive. Like, I don't want to make it sound like it's all gloom and doom, but in general, for most people, things are very hectic. And so as an agency owner, if you are calling on a CMO, it's like, this is truly the time to let go of all the fluff and all the productivity and efficiency and all the buzzwords, and cut to the point. What is the problem that you can very clearly help them solve? Let them, indicate if they've got that problem. And if they do, there's an opportunity. If they don't, now's not the right time. Like this, it is one of those things that you really got to cut through the noise. CMOs are inundated. I can't tell you how many emails I get a day that are cold calls from, agencies, consultancies, people who technically do what we do, who are reaching out like, let me do this for you. Like, there's so much noise. And so getting really, really clear on how you can make their lives less hectic is really where it's at right now.
Yeah, that's great. To dig deeper into that, is there anything that comes to mind as like underappreciated that the CMOs are up against that many or not most of the people reaching out to them might not understand?
I would say in general, their level of understanding of the market, the customer, and the business is very often underappreciated. It is so often, like, if I look at some of the conversations of CMOs that have to go into board meetings, a very common complaint is that so much attention is given to the sales leader and what's happening in sales. And, I hate the cliche, marketing doesn't have its seat at the table, but it is happening a lot where the CMO really truly understands the market and the customer, which is extremely valuable in driving growth and managing costs. And so often that understanding and knowledge is not valued, and not asked for. It's like the input is kept at a minimum. And so not taking CMOs and their experience for granted, is one of, like, it's like untapped resource, so to speak, that so many companies are not leaning into.
Yeah, it's funny because we haven't done this in a while, but we used to have pretty senior marketing leaders on from bigger companies. We had CMO of Levi's on and stuff, and I was always impressed by how they had like this almost sociological level understanding of like the U.S. populace, because there's these giant consumer brands. It's basically like a huge chunk of America, and they just really understood that. It was pretty interesting to dig into things with them. So to shift gears a little bit, so you host the Rehab podcast. Can you talk a little bit about that, and specifically the name? Like, what does Revenue Rehab refer to?
It's like therapy, but for your funnel. And so one of the things, so I'm a big proponent of mental health and therapy, and I have talked very openly about my own journey and, my experience with therapy. And to me, the real value of therapy is having that sounding board that can really help you work through what your challenges are. Because so often, like in therapy, it's not even the therapist telling me anything insightful. It's the therapist asking me the right questions, and I am actually solving my own problems. And so we came up with that name because leading revenue, so whether you're leading marketing, sales, success, but leading a go-to-market function is a tough gig. And it is one that is constantly changing. And especially for the head of marketing, it can always feel very lonely. And so, Revenue Rehab was a way for me to engage that go to market community, to talk about those challenges that we're all facing, to share some understanding of like, here's how I did it. Not that my way is necessarily going to work for your business, but here's how I solve this. Or let's raise the question, and maybe nobody's solved it, but together we can talk through how it could be solved. And then the other piece of it was not just tackling the practitioner portion of the marketing leader, but tackling the whole person. And so we talk about leadership. We've talked about personal topics like caring for aging parents or executive burnout or some of those other things that do impact us as leaders, even if they're not about the job. And so that is really, why I wanted to start the podcast, to have a little bit different of a flavor so that we can collectively work through these challenges together.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's a harder time to be a CMO than maybe it ever has been because, as you talked about at the top of the show, there's this need to become more and more specialized and to understand the market and to understand all aspects of a business. So it's almost like they're pigeonholing themselves into a particular company or a particular niche, but yet like the pressure and the attrition for the CMO role, I haven't seen the numbers in a while, but I think it keeps going down, I guess, right? Like the average tenure of a CMO is like, I'm not sure what it is now, but how are how are the people you're having on the show and clients, like how are they balancing that and what's keeping them ahead of it?
Yeah, so it's an interesting dynamic because I do think that there are a lot of reasons why we see that turnover. And one of the things that I have noticed in more recent years is some of that turnover is because CMOs are starting to no longer accept being in spaces where they're not valued. And so, where at one point, I think there were a lot of CMOs being forced out of their roles. I do think we've been seeing a little bit of that shift of people wanting to go and work where they are valued and appreciated, and being very quick to recognize this ain't that environment, so I need to go someplace else. Um, it's I've read a lot of different studies in the why the turnover's high. I think disconnected with the CEO not being financially savvy to be able to have those appropriate conversations with the CFO. Those are often, really common things. But then I think quite often there is a lot of blame placed on marketing, and in some places they will point fingers that are more collective challenges and not necessarily a CMO challenge. um so yeah, there's a lot of different things, but I can't say that I necessarily have my fingers solidly on why this is happening. But those are some of my observations.
Yeah, and it seems like it's maybe, more intense part of an overall trend of just higher attrition, lower tenures, compared to like my parents' generation where you'd be in a company for decades or whatever it was. So
Yeah.
that makes sense. Kind of getting towards the end of our time, I'd love to hear just kind of like what are you working on over the next few months? What are you excited about at Tegrita or the podcast or anything else?
Yeah, so podcast just went through a revamp, which, after 150 episodes, it was time for a little bit of a change. And so we've shifted to have 3 different episode formats. So that's been really exciting. The other thing is this year, or really we made the shift last year, but now really focusing on it this year, I have shifted in taking on a larger role as a key opinion leader and really helping to share my knowledge, experience with the broader go-to-market community, and trying to, focus a lot more on middle of funnel because that is a place where we see a huge missed opportunity. But really, most exciting thing is just, getting my arms around everything that's happening in the industry and what's impacting businesses and being able to shape that in a way that more companies have access to what we're finding. So whether it's working directly with us, the content that we publish, we're working on a new workshop style thing for companies that don't actually need a consultancy to come in, where we can kind of just come in, teach you kind of a train the trainer kind of model. So there's lots of exciting things that we're working on, with the goal really being able to share our knowledge and experience to help change the way that, people are generating and scaling revenue.
Yeah, for sure. I know we're kind of in a similar mode, and I think that teaching seems like it's becoming a much bigger part of what it means to be an agency or a consultancy or anything else, because it's just these lines are getting blurrier. So it's cool that you're going in that direction. And with that in mind, yeah, where can people go to follow what you're up to and so on?
Yeah, so you can always follow me online. So on LinkedIn, Brandi Starr, definitely let me know that you heard me here. And then we've got, so Revenue Rehab has become more than just the podcast. It is our community and where we publish the majority of our content. And then, of course, Tegrita.com. You can connect to all of the things.
Awesome. This has been a lot of fun, Brandy. Let's do it again before long. We'll get that all linked up. Thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you.